20 years on, the Ireland now and the understanding of child protection, the understanding of what went on in the church, it is radically different than when you first spoke up.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, there are obviously still very significant gaps, as we know. We're a long way from being perfect, but things have fundamentally changed. When people like me and others started to come forward from the mid-90s, and in many cases, many earlier than that on, there was a refusal or a reluctance to believe that this was even possible and that this could be happening. I can remember moving back to Ireland in 2003 to set up 1 in 4 here, and one of the big debates was whether or not stay safe. A very basic child safeguarding intervention in schools that just taught children about their right to dignity and to privacy. Whether or not that should be made mandatory. It was a very, very, very different Ireland and a very different attitude to child sexual abuse.
And therefore, what you did was all the more significant because it is much easier, not saying that it is easy, but it is easier for people to speak up if they find themselves the kind of victims of something that you were. What gave you at the time the strength and desire to say, I'm going to tackle this institution?
Well, it was a gradual process, to be honest, Anton. Like, I left Wexford when I was 17 in 1984, early 1984, and came to Dublin, then went to London for a few years. And after about 10 years in London, the best way I can describe it is that I'd started to stop running from my past and from myself and from my sense of self. And I knew that there was some stuff I had to deal with, but I wouldn't even let myself consciously acknowledge what that stuff was. And then over the next couple of years, I began to talk to some of my family, one of my sisters in particular, about the fact that I'd been raped and abused by a priest in Ferns, in Wexford. And then, by just wild coincidence, there was a family wedding in Ballymurn in County Wexford where the priest who had assaulted me was the parish priest. And my sister told me that when she went to that wedding, she saw that he was spending times around lots of young boys, and that just completely freaked me out. And at that point, I recognized, well, now I have to do something about this. So initially, I thought and this is gas, and it really is an indication of how we all felt at the time, or how society operated at the time, that even I, who had for 12 years had nothing to do with the Catholic Church and was living in another country, my first inclination was to write to the bishop to tell him what had happened, not to go to the guards. Now, thankfully, I didn't do that, but that was my first inclination, because that's what you did. The notion that somehow you would report the church to the civil authorities was crazy, or it seemed crazy at the time. Now, thankfully, I didn't do it. And in February of 1995, I came back to Ireland and reported what had happened to me to the guards. And thankfully, they put in place, a guy called Detective Pat Mulcahy down in Wexford put in place just a really extraordinary investigation. Within 6 weeks, he had gone out and found another 5 people who were ready to make criminal complaints. I knew nothing about the scale of that. Within 18 months, I found out that the diocese had been aware that this priest had sexually assaulted children whilst he was a seminarian, and they still appointed him a priest. A short while after that, I found out that concerns about him had been sent directly to the Vatican, that parishioners had written to the papal nuncio here in Ireland, and the nuncio had responded to say that the Holy See, i.e. the office of the Pope, is aware of your concerns. But he remained in ministry and continued to abuse for decades after that. So that led me to, by 1998, deciding to take a civil action, a legal case against the diocese and against the Vatican. So I launched that civil case in 1998.
Now, was that fueled by the same child protective desire? Was that anger? Was that resentment? Why? Because that's a big step to take on the heft of the church in a lawsuit.
Yeah, I can remember meeting with my then solicitor, who came to London to meet with me, and driving down, having made that decision that I would add the Vatican to the case, that the Vatican would be part of the case, and just thinking, this is nuts. Like, how do you even do this? Driving over Blackfriars Bridge in particular, where a whistleblower against the church had been found hanging some years earlier after a financial scandal, and all of those things are in my head. But no, I mean, it was a very logical step for me, because every step that I took was informed by a new piece of information that meant that there was another question that had to be answered. And what amazed me was that there was no authority that was looking to find answers to those questions. And then finally, when the criminal case got into court in 1999, in March of 1999, and when it became very clear that he was facing a conviction, Sean Fortune, the priest, ended his own life. the state effectively said, right, that's it now. The charges were struck out because he was dead and that was it, they were over. And I was left going, hang on, there's a massive, deeper systemic issue here that we have to understand. So that legal case became even more important then. And then in 2002, I had founded 1&4 in London and had done a big investigative documentary into a case of a network of offenders on Merseyside with Newsnight. During the course of that, the producer of that documentary heard about my own story, my own case, and spent about a year talking me into making a documentary about that case, about the case of Suey the Pope. And ultimately, I agreed to make the documentary and came back to Ireland to make it and to research it. That went out in March of 2002. And I had no real expectation of what would follow on from that, because as far as I was concerned, a lot of this was out there in some form.
Yes, it was in the public domain, if not in the public mind.
There was something there, right? Enough was known, it felt like, right? But the documentary actually had an enormous impact. And I think it was the first time 4 of us came forward in the documentary, and it was me going back to talk to people about what had happened and talked about exactly what had happened to us in detail, in a way that had never been talked about before. So we were no longer talking euphemistically about sexual assault. We talked about what was done to us and the impact that it had and what happened, and revealed the extent of the church's knowledge insofar as we possibly could. And that led then to just huge public uproar, which was surprising, because in 2002, you didn't have satellite or cable TV. BBC Two, this went out at 11:15 on BBC Two on a Tuesday night. It was seen along the eastern seaboard. It was 2 weeks before it was shown on Irish TV eventually, when RTE broadcast it. And by then, the then Bishop of Ferns, Brendan Comiskey, had resigned on foot of what the documentary had revealed. And that was huge. That was the first time there'd been a significant resignation, really anywhere in the world, on foot of these kinds of cases.
It must have felt like a dam burst, did it?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a crazy time, Anton, that... 1&4 was based in, and still is actually in the UK, based in an office building, converted above a shop in Catford in southeast London. And, this little office that we'd only set up a few years earlier was suddenly being inundated with calls from Ireland, like thousands of calls coming in from people wanting to report cases or look for support. And that's what led to us then looking to come back to Ireland to set up 1&4 here in Ireland, which we did a year later. We established the organisation here. And I don't think that, with the rapid pace of what was happening and the scale of what was happening, I don't know that I had time to think about this feels like it just needed to be responded to. The documentary went out. There was a massive call for response. I remember holding a press conference in Buswell's Hotel, which is where everybody holds press conferences, if you want a politician to go to, at least it was in 2002, for 1&4, at which point we talked about the need for a state investigation into what had happened in Ferns, pointing out that we didn't believe Ferns was unique, but that we believed Ferns would be typical of what happened in diocese, and that we knew enough of what happened to be able to drill down to understand the systemic issues at play, and that should be a first step investigating these cases here in Ireland. And critically, that the investigation needed not just to be into, first of all, we were very clear, this isn't an investigation into whether abuse happened. We know it did. It's an investigation into how did the church, and then critically state agencies, because nobody was talking about the responsibility of the state in this, respond to complaints, suspicions, or concerns of abuse perpetrated by priests in the Diocese of Ferns. What did they do on foot of those concerns, suspicions, or complaints? And what do we need to learn from that? What was the systemic response?
And of course, so much of what was revealed then led to further investigations in other dioceses and gave a broader understanding of the patterns of behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, the Dublin inquiry, the Murphy report, the Klein report, they all flowed directly from that inquiry.
20 years on, therefore, if where you started was that instance of Sean Fortune still being having access to boys, and you're feeling that you had to do something, do you look back? I know it's an odd phrase to use in it, but I think it would be deserved. Do you look back at what you achieved with pride?
I look back with enormous pride at what we achieved, because I'm not being, this is no false humble brag or anything, right? I genuinely don't see it as something that I uniquely achieved. People had talked about what was happening before, right, in institutions and in other places. Like if you go back through Oireachtas debates from the 1940s and 50s, they're littered with people talking about. Society wasn't ready to listen. There was something about the moment. I accept absolutely that the way that I did this and the way that I came forward was key. but also, frankly, the fact that people were ready to and wanted to listen and then responded so powerfully was absolutely critical. And that's what drove that change. And frankly, I think that's what always drives any major social change. And in Ireland, we shouldn't underestimate the scale of change that created. I can remember meeting with a then very, very senior government minister who told me that in 2003, that until relatively recently to that date, it was normal practice for any major piece of social policy or legislation to be passed by the church hierarchy before it went to cabinet, never mind to the Oireachtas. Like, that's the level of church control that there was over the state and over our political system. And that's what this inquiry really broke for the first time.